Good evening and welcome to the Palestinian Return Centre's annual Return Week panel discussion. My name is Farah Kataini and I'll be hosting this panel discussion on behalf of the Palestinian Return Centre. Return Week is an annual commemoration to mark the anniversary of UN Resolution 194, which this year is its 75th anniversary. UN Resolution 194 outlines the legally enshrined right of return for all Palestinian refugees. Return Week was created 4 years ago. It was created out of necessity in light of current political transformations, specifically the US and Israel's efforts to normalize Palestinian refugees into their current host countries in order to undermine and nullify the Palestinian right of return, as well as astronomical funding cuts to UNRWA. The current intensifications of Israeli violence in Gaza has exacerbated the suffering of Palestinian refugees at an unprecedented rate. The numbers of Palestinians murdered since October 7th has surpassed that of the 1948 Nakba. The number of Palestinians displaced since October 7th have now surpassed that of the 1948 Nakba. Before introducing our notable lineup of speakers this evening that we have the privilege of hearing from today, I just wanted to amplify calls from Palestinian trade unions, which have called for a general strike today, Monday, December 11th, a strike consisting of work, school, university strikes to not buy anything, to not transfer money, use banks, and to inform the people around us why we're undertaking the strike. Please keep up to date with further strike action led by Palestinian trade unions and civil societies by following groups like the Palestinian Youth Movement, Within Our Lifetime, and Eye on Palestine. Now, to introduce our first speaker for this year's Return Week's annual panel, our first speaker is Muhannad Ayash. Muhannad is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence. He was born and raised in Silwan, Jerusalem, before immigrating to Canada, where he is now an associate professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. Muhannad has a forthcoming book titled Lordship and Liberation in Palestine and Israel. Over to you, Muhannad.
Thank you so much, Farah, and for the Palestine Return Center for organizing this panel and for inviting me to speak. Obviously, we are in a very difficult moment for the Palestinian people. We are seeing an intensification of Israeli violences, genocidal violences that have been going on for over 75 years. We're not here talking just about a Nakba as an event that happened in 1948. But as a structural genocide that has been ongoing for all of those years. I won't spend too much time because I think the audience already knows this story, talking about Zionism and the nature of the Zionist project. But I just want to emphasize that this is an ongoing Nakba. Palestinians have been calling it an ongoing Nakba forever. That's because it has never stopped. And the Israeli plan has always been the same, to take over the entire territory from the river to the sea and make it exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty, make it so that it is under exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty. It is already in practice under Israeli Jewish sovereignty, but they want to make that official. And that means expelling Palestinians from their lands, continuing to expel Palestinians from their lands, and replacing them with Israeli Jewish settlers. What the Israeli state, so we have to understand these events that have been occurring the last 2 months are all situated within that larger context of a structure of genocide. What the Israeli state has been doing the last 2 months is that it saw October 7th as a pretext for it to enact a plan that it has always sought to enact, which is to eliminate Palestinians from their lands and homes and expel them and never allow them to return, to kill as many Palestinians as possible in the process as well. This is the brutal reality of what we're talking about. There is no here, all of these concepts of collateral damage and what have you. These are not actually revealing the reality. This is not just a matter of collateral damage that Israel is doing today. This is all intentional and deliberate. When you cut off food, water, electricity, fuel, when you deliberately, it's obvious to anybody with an honest bone in their body that this is a deliberate bombing of as many civilians as possible, of bombing all the infrastructure that makes life possible: schools, shelters, hospitals, bakeries, resources for water, clean drinking water, you name it. Everything is being destroyed. Educational institutions, cultural institutions, mosques, churches, you name it. They're trying to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable for Palestinians. This is clear to anybody who looks at this honestly. And their end goal, what they want to achieve, I'm not saying that is what they will achieve. I hope not. But what they want to achieve is to remove Palestinians from the entirety of the Gaza Strip. I don't even think it's just the northern parts of Gaza. I think at first I thought they would just restrict themselves to that, but it doesn't seem like it anymore. It seems like they're trying to push as many Palestinians off as much land as possible across the Gaza Strip and prevent them from ever returning to it. And this is the core foundation of the Israeli state. The violences that we see today and all their brutalities, this is exactly how the Israeli state was founded. Obviously, the technology is much more brutal. The technologies of war are much more brutal, and they're killing huge numbers of people and destroying bigger buildings and what have you. But it's the same form of violence, right? It's all about destroying Palestinian society and destroying Palestinian life and destroying Palestinian existence on their lands so that Israelis can take it and call it part of Israel. A critical part of this genocidal project is really twofold. One is, of course, the technological and technical capacity to undertake this kind of genocidal operation, which the Israeli state has developed over years of funding and military support from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Canada, and other Western European places. But second, what I want to focus on a little bit more here is the concealment of genocide from public discourse. Basically, calling genocide something other than what it is so that people can allow it then to happen. So the concealment of violence is as critical for states as is their capacities for violence. So if they're able to conceal the brutality of their violence, they're able to continue to undertake it. And there are many ways in which we're seeing that today. Obviously, there's the Zionist propaganda, the Israeli state propaganda, Zionist organizations, Israeli lobby groups, complicit nation states like the UK and Canada and the US. They're all participating in this concealment. Some of it is of course, laughable, like some of the videos that the IDF is putting out, like the one we saw yesterday or 2 days ago now, I can't remember the dates, but of them allegedly, arresting and detaining Hamas fighters, militants, and their proof was this guy raising his gun after they undressed them all. This guy raising his gun over his head and going and putting it down. I mean, the whole thing was deconstructed within seconds by Palestinians online who are not paid by a state to deconstruct Israeli state propaganda. But their propaganda is so pathetic that people online are able to deconstruct it within literally minutes. And then they're scrambling to either take it down, delete their posts, or whatever. So we're seeing those forms of concealment, but there are also all kinds of other forms of concealment. One I heard this morning on Al Jazeera, and I can't recall the name of the professor from the UK, but he was on Al Jazeera talking about how, for the sake of human rights and for the sake of saving Palestinian lives, We need to stop talking about these politicized terms such as ethnic cleansing and genocide, and we should just focus on getting Gazans, Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip and into Egypt, into the Sinai desert, in order to save their lives. You know, he presented the whole thing, and I don't care if he genuinely believes that as a humanitarian or not. It doesn't really matter to me. But you know, he presents that as like, if you really care about saving those people's lives, you would just work on, work your hardest to move them out of Gaza and into the Sinai, so that then Israel can just fight Hamas. And when that's over, then we can deal with what happens next. These sorts of discourses that present themselves as just concerned with saving human lives, and this is just a practical thing that we have to do now to save human lives. I mean, they are at best naive. At worst, they're part of Israeli state propaganda, because that's what the Israeli state has been saying from the beginning. They wanted to kick all the Gazans out from Gaza and put them in the Sinai desert, and then never allow them to return. This is it's a death warrant what they're giving to those people when they're saying that. I mean, they couldn't care less what happens to those people, the Israelis. But scholars like this person repeating these lines in the name of saving lives, and then people talking about ethnic cleansing and genocide as politicizing the conflict and politicizing the lives of these people. I mean, that's just pure rubbish. That's just a naive, like I said, at best a naive understanding of the context, because you can't make sense of the Israeli plan for Gaza and for Palestinians unless you put it within the paradigm of genocide and ethnic cleansing, unless you put it into the paradigm of settler colonialism, because that is what it is. And only when you understand that can you actually put forward real solutions. You know, I was glad that there was another speaker on that panel on Al Jazeera this morning to counter this nonsense, and he did it very well. And one of the points he brought up was, really, if you're really concerned about getting people out of Gaza for their safety, okay, let Israel open its borders and let them back to their lands inside of what is today called Israel, and let them stay there until they're safe, and then they'll return to Gaza. How about that? But of course, this doesn't enter the mind of people who don't really understand Israeli settler colonialism. So to me, honestly, any effort to understand what is happening today outside of the settler colonial paradigm is doomed to not understand what is happening, and doomed to repeat the same cycles of violence, because ultimately all it does is just conceal them. When you conceal violences like this, you just perpetuate them. So we must continue to call out Israeli genocide. We must continue to call out ethnic cleansing. We must continue to call out Israeli settler colonialism, because that is the root cause of the problem. And unless we talk about it in these very clear terms, these honest terms, then we are bound to see the continuation of Israeli settler colonialism and the expulsion and elimination of Palestinians and Palestine. And this is the critical point that I want to highlight here on Return Week. We have not given up our right to return since 1948. We're not going to give it up anytime soon, or I should say ever. We're just not going to do that. We are attached to our lands. We insist on returning to our lands, and we will return to our lands. The only question that remains is the manner of our return. How are we going to return? And I would advise the Israelis population now, not the Israeli state or the Israeli government, because they are settler colonial root and stem, but the Israeli people, if they do want to see a kind of return that enables them to also remain on their lands and to be part of this new entity that would grow out of this region that includes both Palestinians and Israelis, I would encourage them to also join us in this effort. Because the other option is going to be an all-out regional war. I mean, to me, this is not a very difficult question. People are not going to forget any of this that is happening today. People in the region are all growing up now. There's a whole generation of millions of people growing up right now, witnessing this act of genocide. They're not going to forget this. And you're not going to be able to, forcefully make them forget it, no matter how hard you try. So I don't see another path for a healthy return for everyone except through economic pressure and political pressure on Israel. Otherwise, you're choosing war. And I can discuss that more in the Q&A, but I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was very insightful and well put. And hopefully we can delve a bit deeper in the Q&A. Just to go on to our second speaker of this panel discussion. So our second speaker is Berna Abu Zalouf. Berna is a PhD candidate in international law at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. Berna is a Palestinian interdisciplinary researcher. Her research interests are epistemic oppression, transitional justice, intersectional and decolonial solidarity, decolonization, TWAIL, and international law vulnerabilities. Over to you, Berna.
Thank you so much, Farah, for inviting me, and thanks for the Palestine Return Center. It's an honor for me to be speaking a second time with you, in fact, after this genocidal war on Gaza. For today's talk, really, I'm going to do read off of slides, and I will basically be presenting on really the continuation of what Mohammed was speaking of, is, how do we look at, accountability for this? In fact, actually, in terms of the 75 years, comment that you said about this resolution for right of return 194, it's not the only thing that had been 75 years up until now, and it's really the Genocide Convention that has also been since 75 years ago as well. So you can see how drastic and in fact actually problematic to see this celebration of this the signing of this convention while there is an ongoing genocide where there is nothing happening and no accountability and no stopping and no kind of pressure from the international community. In fact, actually, the international community is itself absolutely complicit. So today's talk, I'm going to mention a bit about a paper that I've written called "Contesting International Law's Verticality: A Wales Perspective." So international law verticality really means that there's this concept of the idea that international law is in fact horizontal, that it applies to everyone equally. I argue against that, and I say that in fact international law is actually vertical. It is applied within the realms of politics, within the realms of global economic world order, and it's in terms of capitalism, imperialism, and it does not materialize outside of it. And I use TWAIL, as in the third world approaches to international law, as a sort of approach, because the third world countries and people, as well as the global south, have different perspectives and understanding of international law than just normal Western scholars have. And Palestine is among those in the global south as well that share that sort of perspective. So if we speak about what's happening right now in Gaza, but we are not seeing any accountability. So, and in fact, this is an really revealing of really the how international law and politics kind of work, and also the double standard, as well as we see now with no urgency to act on the situation of Palestine, unlike the situation of Ukraine, in which you've seen absolute direct kind of opening of investigation in the International Criminal Court, and 15 days in of that, releasing a summon for Putin to attend the court, so an arrest warrant. So you can see that, Palestinian dispossession really has long been aided and abetted by the international community. We're looking at, the colonial history, but also just continuation of that with, giving, Israel a complete impunity for their crimes against Palestinians, right? So, the international community and, the colonial state of Israel, created refugees, and now the refugees are denied the return. And specifically now, as we're seeing in Gaza, the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza are, 70% of them are refugees themselves, and now are again, being, forcibly displaced from their homes. Again, another wave of Nakba. Not that the Nakba, ended. So how can really the international community and then Western powers ensure Israeli accountability to international law when they are themselves complicit? So if we understand that there has to be an urgency by the Western countries, because that's how international law works, there has to be pressure to open investigations, support, financial support, and also other types of support, and also other types of pressure like sanctions and whatnot, to increase kind of the level of action towards accountability. But if they don't want to, and if they are themselves complicit, then how can we ensure accountability? And is there another level that we can look into about international law that would reveal that this accountability is in itself farce? So in this paper, I really try to argue that, the urgency to act, on human rights violations is usually contingent on states' political interests, as evidenced by the immediate action taken on the Ukrainian war. But that also, I argue that another visible dimension is also Western states' urgency to act in the global North-South dichotomy that is also built on colonial history, ingrained in international law, selective responsiveness, right? So lastly, I look into, how do these, third world approaches to international law scholars and how the scholarship of TWAIL, how can it expose this Western exceptionalism when it comes to, accountability? So how do we make sense of this paradox? So we can see that, in the international community has denied Palestinians the right, to self-determination from the inception of the Palestinian oppression under the British mandate, and then to the United States, to the United Nations, that has been passed on, the kind of the question of Palestine, and then decided to give the colonizers the right to colonize by addressing them as equal and providing them with land in the division of land, really, by the United Nations. And then nowadays we have the Israeli settler colonial conquest of Palestine, which materializes also in its apartheid practices. So principally, really, the UN resolution 194 really called for the right of return to displaced people, but in fact, actually, in reality, Palestinians only received humanitarian aid, that was, given through the UNRWA set. So weren't given right of return. We were just provided with some sort of support, humanitarian aid. So, and this sort of humanitarian aid continued until today to make up some sort of, tool of suppression that is added alongside the other tools of suppression, basically putting Palestinians on a line of, kind of pacification, acceptance, and sort of, also, kind of pushing away the idea of return from the minds of Palestine by forced sedentarization, and with understanding that the right of return is really central to Palestinians, because it's often removed from the trajectory of Palestinian right to self-determination, and also to talks about solutions where it's never about Palestinians' right to return, which is an acknowledgement that this is settler colonialism and not just occupation. So, we look at, accountability through international law. So one of the things that, in my paper, I look into is this coercive efforts that's been, pushed by people's by international community, by international governments, by civil society, international organizations, to force this sort of compromise, to make a compromise on decolonial kind of ideology and right of return. So compromising both decolonization and right of return in return for statehood. So it's often been, we'll give you a state which is under the line of the two-state solution, but you have to give up both the decolonization and right of return. So despite this being stipulated in a resolution, in international forums and international kind of talks and in professional venues, this is often denied. So but Palestinians have always had different perceptions of justice that are often denied legitimacy. So despite the contradiction, however, that Palestinians do not have some sort of absolutely nihilistic understanding of international law, that they don't want to pursue international law for accountability. There's often this idea that Palestinians don't want accountability. That's not true. In fact, Palestinians want accountability. The problem is that it's often very difficult to deny the critical issues within international law, specifically its colonial and predatory onset towards the global south. So there's a position of international law here, its history as well, that is very problematic in its inability to overcome the political element of urgency to act. And all of that really feeds into kind of the lack of enforceability of this international law. So if international law is made for all people, then we can see why we cannot deny that it poses a bit of a question around why that there is a genocide happening at the moment and there's no accountability, right? So how does the disregard of the right of return expose the dynamics of global governance over Palestine? So this paper really explores the promises of the international community to Palestinians. But often these these promises are often met actually with performative humanitarianism and also with non-recognition. So they don't recognize the Palestinians or their plights, but the only thing that they allow them is performative humanitarianism and aid. So you would often see those in statements as well, is that we will increase humanitarian aid or we will cut aid. So this idea that Palestinians are sort of beggars and subalterns, or people who are just waiting for the Western community to just kind of provide aid to, without any idea or about without any kind of consideration towards actually the humanity of Palestinians, but also the agency of Palestinians to decide their own fate. So this paper also argues the double standard, again with international laws, with international community's response to Ukraine, and its response to Israeli crimes at the moment. But also, it seeks to expose this idea that, there is absolutely a dimension here of the global north and global south, and Palestine is still among the global south. So would we ever see international law in today's world, in today's capitalist, imperialist, bloody, militarist world? Would we see that justice for people from the global south? It is hard to see that among those realities. So in relation to, in fact, the shocking visit by the general prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, he visited the occupied Palestinian territories. The occupied territories. In fact, actually, his picture was in Jerusalem, and he said that he visited Israel. Which was absolutely, abhorrent of him for someone who should be both impartial and neutral, to say something like that, and also to visit, the country that is not a signatory of the ICC, is not a member, and is not signatory of the Rome Statute. So the plights of Palestinians, have been unheard. You see civil society always calling Karim Khan to visit and see. They've called him to visit Gaza as well, to see, document the war crimes and the genocide and things like that. But no, he refused to see that. So you can see kind of the also, the inherent racism in international law as well. So the idea is, if we're asking, if we're fighting for the right of return today, how can we really return if we are continuously displaced or under the threat of displacement? So can we fight for the right of return when when there's still the main kind of issue? The issue is that, there's a current kind of, genocide happening in Gaza, and people are, being eliminated completely in a concentration camp. So really, it's hard to really overlook Nakba, also overlook Gaza as a right of return issue as well, because there is also the displacement as well of Gazans that will remain, even after the end of this. That so many have been displaced from their homes. So, the response of the international community has always been about, this unwavering support for Israel versus humanitarian aid for Palestinians. So ignoring the underlying cause of Palestinian dispossession and oppression effectively denies them the agency to alleviate it. So by refusing to recognize Palestinian right to self-determination and only providing passive assistance through humanitarian aid, the Western governments, they cement the status of Palestinians as a subordinate group who receive only conditional support upon their acceptance of the two-state solution, and the larger status quo of dominance and ethnic cleansing. So this forced attachment of humanitarian aid in statements by Western politicians about the slaughter in Gaza shows clearly the erroneous logic by which the humanitarian support becomes inhumane and support for the right of return without self-determination becomes an oxymoron, right? So I don't know why this showed up as white, but I will read it off. And so the last slide really is looking at, if international law is not horizontal, it is vertical. So how can we really understand that, this sort of exceptionalism in today's world and what's happening in Gaza, and understanding that, how do you move forward? How, as people who have lost absolutely faith in all of this, in both the humanity of the international community, the humanity of the world, and how they can just witness this genocide unfold without acting, but also understanding that this verticality in itself is oppressive. So international law in fact is not emancipatory. It's in fact the opposite. It is violent in itself, right? So it is not a tool of accountability. It's a tool to remind us that, we are worth less than that of Western, people and Western civilization. It's to remind us that this idea, that, the colonizer and colonized in world system, not just an idea in specific context, but the world system itself, imperialism, the idea that we thought that this was dismantled because we lived in sort of this imagination of a post-colonial world. We can see that this is very problematic. This whole exceptionalism, really, and the fact that there's no recognition for this accountability, perpetuated this system that continuously, caused Palestinians to be oppressed, caused Palestinians to be denied the most important right, which is the right to decolonize and also the right to return to their land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think I learned so much myself from just hearing you speak there in your presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Our next speaker and our final speaker is Tommy McKerney. Tommy is a former Irish political prisoner, hunger striker, spending 53 days on hunger strike, and today is an active trade unionist, author, and activist. It is an absolute honor and privilege to be hosting you today, Tommy. Your intersectional solidarity inspires many, and just going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Farah, and thank you for this invitation. It's an honor to be able to contribute to this discussion. From the outset, could I just possibly apologize? I don't have the same depth of knowledge or insight that your previous speakers or you yourself would have. I'm not obviously a Palestinian, but I can not only empathize with the plight of the horrendous plight of the Palestinian people, but I think from Ireland's experience, we have an insight into what's happening. We ourselves were colonized, and although it's not a term that would be familiar with your listeners, but in Ireland, we would describe what you talk of the settler colonies in Israel. We would call them planters. Plantation of Ulster, where I came from, happened several centuries ago and was quite similar to what's happening today in Palestine. What I would like to point out, I think, is the fact that while not for 1 second should we exonerate or have any time at all to excuse the Zionist regime in Israel, but I think we've got to also look fundamentally at the role of global imperialism, particularly that of the United States of America, which to a large extent is not only playing a vital role in support of Israel, but effectively, I would argue, mentoring and directing what's happening in Israel. To a large extent, Israel serves almost as a garrison for global imperialism led by the United States of America. This garrison in the Middle East, which provides the United States with a base to implement its policy of global control, supported, of course, by other imperial powers such as Britain, and the European Union. Without the vast amount of support that the United States gives to Israel, if left without that type of support from particularly the United States and the unconditional support offered by the United States, typified only within the last few days in the United Nations when the United States vetoed a very reasonable call for a ceasefire. Of course, the British abstained in the vote, but those two powers have a very dangerous role to play. It's not just political support, it's military, financial support to Israel, without which, if Israel was left to its own devices, it would be forced to come to terms with its neighbours. It would be forced to come to a reasonable accommodation with the Palestinian people. It just simply wouldn't have the power, wouldn't have the might. Now, at the moment, of course, much of its might is dependent as a result of its support it gets from other imperial powers. So I think we've got to look at those who provide unconditional support for the state of Israel. And let's keep in mind that the type of action that's happening today in Gaza, this genocidal, murderous assault on the population of Gaza, which is clearly aimed to clear the people of Gaza. And could I point out just again one of the, I suppose, small facts that allows us here in Ireland to understand, empathize with the people of Gaza, that the Israeli former minister, and if I'm right in pronouncing it, Amaki Eli Netanyahu, was suggesting that the population of Gaza would be expelled to the Sinai Desert or even Ireland. So I think even the Israelis understand that Ireland has a deep appreciation and support understanding for the people of Palestine and the Palestinian plight, which, bear in mind, is not only now in Gaza, but also the West Bank. And of course, the right to return should be extended right across the entire area from the river to the sea. But the fact is that if you consider what happened to the Native Americans by the colonialist United States, how they practiced genocide, ethnic cleansing of the Native Americans, it's very reminiscent of what's happening today the attempt being made to do the same to the people of Gaza. There is, if you like, a case study for what's happening. It's no accident that the United States of America is au fait with what's happening. They have no excuse for saying that they don't know, because they know perfectly well what's happening. So I think we've got to look at this in the context of the global imperial context. So pressure must be kept, not just obviously on the brutal genocidal regime that is in Israel. That's the Zionist regime that's perpetrating such a slaughter of the defenseless people in Gaza, and also a slightly more disguised attack on the Palestinian people on the West Bank. But also pressure has to be maintained, and not only political pressure, but actually whatever type of pressure we can do on the agents that support and facilitate and actually, and possibly in many ways, direct what's happening, what's being carried out by the Zionist regime, and namely, in principle, led by the United States of America. There's no accident whatsoever that, for example, as I quoted earlier, the vetoing of a ceasefire by the United States, supported or effectively supported by Britain, that they have a vested interest in maintaining the state of Israel. It's not some humanitarian gesture for the past. It's a very cold, cynical, calculated effort. And not only that, but as long as there is a difference, as long as there is dispute, as long as there is no peace in that area, it actually suits the objective. If the Palestinian people could be accommodated, and the people who live in Israel, if they were living side by side in a proper democratic system without any dispute within the country or with their neighbours, it would not suit imperialism. Imperialism actually revels and takes advantage from having Israel at odds with its neighbours, because it suits global imperialist agenda to have that confrontation. But also Israel serves as a type of, as I said, as a garrison for imperialism led by the United States of America. So for those of us if you talk about the global north, we've got to focus on preventing, if at all possible, the United States, Britain, European Union, delivering its military, financial support to the state of Israel, not only political, but military and financial support. For example, in Ireland here, we have an airport, Shannon Airport, which is being used on a regular basis by the US military to fly its supplies and its munitions through Shannon Airport. It's incumbent on us to try and prevent that happening. It should be the same in Britain, where there is many US bases and British Army bases. It has to be acted upon. There's also at the moment a very useful campaign, a very beneficial campaign, where the trade union movement globally is being encouraged and in some places succeeding in preventing the flow of arms and munitions from the global north and elsewhere to Israel. That has to be encouraged, promoted as best as possible, because there has to be global responsibility for what's happening. It's not just sufficient to condemn Israel, which of course we take as read, that's an obscene situation. It's appalling. It's genocidal what's being perpetrated by the Israeli regime. But aided and abetted by others in the West, and I think that has to be highlighted and counteracted to whatever extent is possible and realistic. So I think that's as much as I can say at the moment about a situation which is deplorable, horrendous, heartbreaking. But what we have to say is the courage and fortitude of the Palestinian people is astonishing, heartwarming, and in the long run, I have no doubt that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, thanks to the heroism of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for your insight and your input there. I think it's always important, especially in times like this, to draw on the parallels and the connections of solidarity and also shared history as well. And I think Irish solidarity right now is one of the most beautiful things to see as a Palestinian and as Palestinians around the world. The solidarity across the island is incredible. Thank you so much, Tommy, for your input. I'm just going to go to a few questions from the online audience. I think if we have time, we'll do the first question. If we have time, we'll jump onto a second one. But a question that's been asked a few times is how right now we're in unprecedented times. We are witnessing genocide in Gaza. And how do we, as ordinary people in Canada, in Ireland, in Britain, how can we or what can we do to stop this genocide in Gaza? I think this is one of the most common questions I'm just going to pose to all three of you. Anyone would like to answer that first, or should I just pick someone randomly? Mohammed?
I was just going to say, in case Benna has to go, right? She can take a first crack at it, and then I'm happy to go second if you'd like. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, Benna, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really nice of you to allow me to speak first. In terms of what you can do, there are multiple ways that you can engage, really. But I think the most important thing is to be out and protest and make your make your voice kind of heard. A lot of people have been feeling a bit of fatigue after having gone out to protest a few times. But to be honest, there has been a lot of attention, and it's been worrying also. The state of Israel, this kind of people, kind of massive movement of people in the streets, and this has been quite bad. But also there's been a lot of pressure built up because of it, because it's making it clear what people want. So I think doing that first is really important. But there are also things locally that you can do, like boycott actions as well, that you can do in your local community. You can also do a lot to educate your peers on Palestine. I've seen a lot of people do kind of community level info sessions on Palestine. I think it opens the space to ask people for people to ask about Palestine, to ask what people want, and to clarify a few things, because unfortunately we've seen a lot of terrible and as Mohammed said, laughable propaganda that needs to be dispelled. So I think it's important to always kind of fight that fatigue and constantly go out in the street and do whatever you can do. I've seen people do a lot of things, like direct action, even occupying kind of public spaces and train stations and Ministry for Foreign Affairs. We've had that actually in Ireland, which was quite interesting to see people saying that there's nothing really strong being made or any action beyond just mere words by the Irish government. There are multiple ways, but I think the best thing is to constantly show up when there's something public and collective, because numbers do matter, but also fighting the fatigue and showing them that you're there matters as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Benna, and I totally agree with Tommy's points that this is an anti-imperial struggle. So What people need to understand is that what is good and would work for the Palestinians is actually also good for them. So let me give you the example of Starbucks. I mean, this is not just good for Palestinians that Starbucks is losing all this money and companies are going, oh, wait, support for Israel means I lose money. That's a good thing for Palestinians, but it's also good for people around the world. Why are there Starbucks in Kuwait and Egypt and Turkey and all these other places in the first place? Their coffee is far superior to anything that Starbucks has ever produced. And the list goes on. McDonald's, all the rest of that American crap that nobody needs. It's good for everyone that these companies become smaller. It's good for local economic stability, that your local coffee maker can now create a store that you'll go to and spend money at, as opposed to Starbucks. Like it's just good for everyone when you understand it in that larger anti-imperialist struggle. So what people can do, withdraw your participation. That's the major tool in the toolbox of people power. Withdraw your participation economically, politically, culturally. So politically, if you've ever voted for a politician, send in an email right now. If they've not called for a ceasefire at a minimum, tell them that's it. You're not getting my vote again. Don't tell them, don't give them and say, oh, I was disappointed with you. No, tell them I'm done. No vote for you. You've given them $5. Don't tell them that that's all you gave them, but still tell them I've given money to your campaign before. I'm not doing that again. End of discussion. If you volunteered for them, do the same thing, right? Like, so that's non-participation. That's telling those politicians, no, you lost me. It's over. I hope you lose. And I hope they do lose in the next election. Economics. Where are you spending your money? What companies are you using? Where are your pension? I understand that some of these things get pretty big and you go, well, my money everywhere, can support Israel or the US, or because I'm for boycotting, I'm the US empire too. Let's weaken them too. Weaken Canada, please do. I understand that it can get too big, but just try your best in all of these. Go to the BDS website, see which companies you can target in your BDS campaign. Actions like Tommy was talking about in terms of, oh, there's an airport, helping the American military. Okay, well, let's try our best to stop that. You're not going to succeed in everything. And I encourage people not to think of themselves as individuals in the struggle. A lot of people go, well, I'm just little old me. What can I do against this much structures of power? Like, I can't change those. Of course you can't change those on your own. That's a silly idea. Don't think about it as an individual. Think about yourself as playing your role in a larger group of people. And that's all you can do. That's all you can ask of yourself. So withdraw your participation from these systems of power, and they will listen. This is how systems of power end up listening. They don't listen when you ask them nicely. Only when you withdraw participation and you place economic pressure, political pressure, when they start to see their bottom line affected for companies, they'll start to change. When politicians lose elections and lose funding sources, they'll start to change. This is the only path forward. So wherever you are, join your local communities, join a local anti-imperialist activist group or a pro-Palestine activist group, and educate yourself and participate in these wide array of activities.
Thank you, Mohammed. Tommy, did you want to jump in?
Just a few things, possibly. Yes, BDS, very important, but I think maybe here from Ireland that we should also take a look at our, what we call the diaspora. We have a lot of Irish Americans, we have a lot of Irish in Britain, and unfortunately it appears to me that too many Irish Americans are sympathetic to the Israeli regime. I take it that as ignorance has led them to that situation. I think if we were to contact our relatives and friends and people that we know in the States, there's apparently about 40 million people of Irish descent in the States. We can't contact them all, but we should be able to contact many of them with a very honest appraisal of what's happening in Palestine. The same in Britain. We have a large diaspora in Britain. I think that would be something that we could do to put pressure on the heart of the empire. And I think it's something that we should talk about as well, of course, as attack the idea that Shannon Airport, the airport can be used as a military flyover for the United States military. But something else, I think, it's 75 years since the Nakba happened. The Palestinian people have been suffering for at least 75 years, and before that, under the British mandate, and for a long time, because they've been used and abused for so long. But certainly 75 years since the Nakba. Now, hopefully, and let's hope that the current situation, there may be a ceasefire. Let's hope that there is, that the bloodshed will end, and we hope and we pray for that. But it is not going to solve the long-term situation. This could be a long-term problem. And if the ceasefire came into effect, let's say even at the weekend, there still will be suffering in Palestine. So let's, in Ireland, for example, make sure the next time a US president or vice president or someone comes to Ireland, that they are not made welcome, that we take action, even if it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years time, that there is no welcome for those that are supporting and possibly even directing what's happening in Israel against the desperately unfortunate, victimized Palestinian people.
Thank you, Tommy. And just to reiterate some points that all three of you made as well is in terms of BDS and kind of targets for our solidarity, or to express solidarity rather. A few weeks ago, there was a letter that was written by a collective of Palestinian trade unions that called upon kind of the workers of the world with a conscience to do all that they can to disrupt the Israeli war machine in terms of its weapons factories, its arms factories, its arms depots, its ports where they ship weapons to and from. And there have been efforts all around the world, from around America, from around Turtle Island, from around Italy and docks in South Africa, to stop these weapons getting to the Israeli government. And just to amplify those calls again now, we really underestimate just how interconnected this all is, and how close we actually live as individuals to an airport that is sending weapons to Israel, or a dock or a port that is sending weapons to Israel. And that is a very important target to keep in mind when we're talking about especially direct action and what we can do right now for Palestine and to stop this genocide in Gaza. There was one other question. I know, Benna, we only have a few minutes left with you, so I'll direct this to first for you. But there's a question that's been asked a few times regarding the double standards of the international community, most notably the EU and the UN when it comes to Ukraine and Palestine. Just to leave that to comments for the speakers, if you have any comments on kind of the disparities and the double standards between how the world has responded to both.
I think there's a general kind of problematic understanding of why the international community has supported Ukraine as opposed to Russia. And I think there needs to be a clarification made that, the international community doesn't hold any kind of moral legitimacy. It has not decided to support Ukraine because there was an invasion of Ukraine. It decided to support Ukraine because it has always met the interests of NATO countries, Europe, and the US. So basically, the empire. So it's political. It's always been political. It's not about the protection of human rights. It's not about the idea of the law of occupation or international humanitarian law, or the idea of invasions are wrong. And I think it's not about that. It's just really about kind of this long history of ingrained kind of animosity and enmity with Russia, and also with friendship with Ukraine. Unfortunately, it is like that, and I think it is important to point that that's the reason. Now the thing is that the problem is that the language they use for their support of Ukraine, for how much money and aid and military and weapons they send to Ukraine, is the language of human rights, and they only do it deceptively, really, to justify why they are engaging with Ukraine. So it's really that we must be smarter to not follow into the trap of thinking that language is how they perceive the situation. It's just to make it so that you normalize their support for Ukraine. So, that's why they made it so that, supporting Ukraine was such a high moral stance, right? So the idea is that they, when they were talking about Ukrainian resistance, they were talking about like, this is, fighters, they're freedom fighters, they're fighting for their freedom. But when they talk about Palestinians, it's always like, well, they are terrorists, they are, they want to, they're anti-Semitic, they want to kill all the Jewish people, and all of sorts of, defamatory and also very accusatory language. So that is the double standard, is that that language can be applied in a certain way to a situation that in fact isn't applicable to. So and because but it doesn't apply to a situation in Palestine that is absolutely applicable to. So in the case of Palestine, we have 75 years of colonization. So resistance should absolutely be supported, and it's not a right. It's also a duty in itself. Sorry. In a general sense, I would just say that in terms of the double standard, it's less of a double standard. It's more of a revelation of where the international community stands, and it has always stood that way. It's not that it hasn't. It's just that it's constantly used a different language to justify its violence and to justify its stances and its support, and now using that same language to police Palestinians in how they should respond to their oppression.
Thank you, Bernard. Tommy, Mohammed, anyone want to answer first or want to first?
I mean, I think Bana captured it very well there. It's might makes right. That's what international law is. And that's what all of this discourse on human rights, international human rights that we hear from the US Empire and the British Empire in the past, and the British government today as part of the US Empire now, and France and Germany and Canada. It's shallow talk that just tries to present themselves as part of the forces of the good on this world. Look, the American empire always tries to conceal the reality of the fact that it is an empire. And how part of their key weapons in doing that, rhetorical weapons in doing that, is to say that America just acts on the basis of universal human rights and the interests of all. It just so happens that those universal interests are aligned with American strategic interests. They actually, I'm sure they actually believe the nonsense that they spew out. But who watches that today and believes in it? Who looks at the American position on the genocide of the Palestinians and says, yes, the US stands as the force of good in the world? I think the number of people who actually believe that is shrinking. And that's good, because the more that number shrinks, the more actual reality comes to the surface, and we can see things for what they are. The fact of the matter is, I'm not an international lawyer, but from what I learned from international legal scholars like Ardim Seis and many others, is that most of the stuff that we like in international law today comes from former colonies. After decolonization, they insisted to add certain languages into international law that made it, that gave it some of the good parts that we draw on. But ultimately, it remains a tool for the advancement of Euro-American imperialism. And the majority of the world does not believe that it is somehow a place for real justice or truth or any of those things. So we really need to fight against this imperial project that started hundreds of years ago, that brutalized the Irish, that brutalized millions of people in what is today called Canada and the US and South America, that brutalized millions of Africans, millions of Asians, millions of Arabs, and the list is quite large. This is the project that needs to be dismantled. And where we can create together a new real language for universal human rights and international law. But we're not there. We're not there right now.
Yes. I can add quite little to the first two speakers because I've covered nearly every point. I'd like to possibly point out that when you consider that it's NATO that has taken the lead role in supporting Ukraine, and also it's the NATO forces that are supporting Israel today, I think maybe that's where we can draw the lesson from the disparity. The fact is, and I think as Mohammed has pointed out, that the world is changing, that arguably the United States, although it remains a huge power bloc and the imperial powers are militarily very strong, but they are in decline, that there is a new axis emerging in the world today. And I think that there's still always room for optimism.
100% agree with all three of your answers to that question as well. And even to add briefly as well, the votes in the UN for a ceasefire in Gaza being met with almost unanimous decisions in support of a ceasefire amongst all other countries except just America, and showing that America can actually halt. America has deciding vote over all other countries. I think really should cast a doubt in kind of everyone's minds right now of who these international institutions are there to serve, whose interests they're there to fulfill, and how these bodies are in some way, shape, or form kind of always were created to further imperialist interests. And I think those questions are now finally being asked amongst larger communities and large societies that for decades we kind of placed this blind trust in these international organizations, and now we're seeing exactly who is behind these international organizations, what are their true interests, and, if you will, ulterior motives as well. So that was actually one of the last questions of the Q&A. I'm just going to wrap up now, and I want to say a massive thank you to Bernard, to Mohanna, to Tommy. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your really insightful contributions to today's panel. I just want to wrap up and say thank you as well to everyone who has tuned in and joined us today for this panel discussion, and to please keep up to date with everything that the Palestinian Return Center is organizing and planning this week and also in coming months by following our social media, which is at the Palestinian Return Center and at Return Center. So thank you and good evening.